The Roaring Twenties, a time of abundant wealth and glamour, but underneath the gilded surface laid a dark uncertainty which was about to cripple the nation's economy. As America was being devastated by tragic economic disasters of the 1920s and 1930s, the country was plummeting into the Great Depression. In the midst of this tragedy, the New Deal programs were implemented by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to bring the American people to prosperity. These programs were defined in large part by new regulations on banking and finances. These changes were radical and controversial at the time, but were vital to organizing an economy that was less susceptible to another economic crisis. Many of these regulations have been removed over time, and the economic situation of the country today, in many respects, is similar to how it was before the Great Depression. But there is no doubt that these reforms have had a massive triumphant impact on the modern world, both because of the lasting systems that it established and because of the financial stability that it ushered in. During the 1920s, the American stock market was booming with little to no government interference. An increase in industrialization and urbanization meant more expansions of big business and more people living in cities. These trends contributed to a general perception of the economy as strong, prosperous, and stable, which led to many Americans desiring to invest in the stock market for the first time. However, a large problem that depositors faced was the lack of legal separation between commercial and investment banks, meaning that banks could use depositors' money to make high-risk bets on the market. The fact that so many people and businesses had increasing stake in the stock market made the repercussions all the more devastating when it collapsed. This crash was made inevitable by the extremely fragile state of the American economy, which was described by British politician Philip Snowden as a perfect orgy of speculation. In short, it was due for a massive correction, and when this happened, everyone was affected. The Dow fell 25% over the first 2 days of the crash. Many banks and individuals who invested in the stock market lost all of their money, and many who got their money via bank loans couldn't pay back the suffering banks, leading to bankruptcy amongst both the banks and the people. In addition, the decentralized, disorganized nature of the Federal Reserve System, along with the restraint of charging high interest rates on loans in order to fund the gold standard, which was gold held by the federal government that backed all currency in the United States, led to its refusal to give out loans or to lower interest rates to stimulate recovery. The effects of the Depression were felt in every crevice of American finance. From 1929 to 1933, stock prices were cut by 1/5 and almost 10,000 bank suspensions occurred, which is when banks stopped allowing people to convert their deposits into cash, usually in response to mass withdrawal or bank runs. The tangible manifestation of the Great Depression, catalyzed by the stock market crash, was the daily sight of crowds filled with starving people waiting for food in bread lines and soup kitchens. During his presidency, Herbert Hoover did very little in face of the Great Depression. All of the rapidly worsening effects of the Great Depression led the American people to call for drastic action via the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At the time, he was the governor of New York and an outspoken advocate for drastic government action to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression. The popular desire for this action was so potent that some even advocated for giving Roosevelt dictatorial powers as president, and while this was not the result, he beat incumbent President Hoover in an electoral college landslide with 42 out of 48 states, and was sworn in as the 32nd president on March 4, 1933.
When Roosevelt was inaugurated, the country was in such dire straits that it was very close to a revolution or another civil war. And many people forget that it was really teetering on the edge.
President Roosevelt immediately reversed Hoover's economic disposition upon taking office via a rapid succession of new policies. According to President Hoover, our banking system was the weakest link in our whole economic system, the worst part of the dismal tragedy with which I had to deal. Roosevelt likely agreed with this particular sentiment, as he declared a national bank holiday 2 days after becoming president, freezing operation of all banks in the country, and during that holiday, signed the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. This act had examiners verify that banks were secure, and had the Federal Reserve banks give loans to struggling banks.
They began giving people confidence, for example, in the banking system, which they had lost.
I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress.
A subsequent piece of banking legislation passed as part of the New Deal was the Banking Act of 1933, commonly known as the Glass-Steagall Act, after its sponsors Senator Carter Glass and Representative Henry B. Steagall. One of the main features of this act was that it outlawed the combination of commercial and investment banks. This reassured the American people that their money would be safely deposited rather than risked on the stock market by bankers. It had many other provisions, but the most significant of these was one that created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
Basically, what would happen is that people would get scared, right? A bank would be about to fail. Then what would happen would be called a bank run. Everyone would flock to the bank trying to get their money out, because if the bank failed, they might lose their life savings. Because they didn't have what we take for granted today, which is FDIC. So if you put money into a bank, it's insured for up to $250,000.
In fact, the FDIC has been functioning effectively since 1934, and as of the second fiscal quarter of 2018, it partially insured deposits to 5,542 institutions. Additionally, the gold standard was partially eliminated by the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, with which the government ordered all banks to turn over their gold backups to the Treasury.
The United States must take firmly in its own hands the control of the gold value of our dollar.
This freed up banks to give out loans to stimulate business without having to charge high interest rates on these loans to maintain the gold standard, which led to the recovery of many businesses. The removal of this handicap on the Federal Reserve continues to benefit modern businesses in a similar fashion.
The New Deal fundamentally changed the role of the federal government in the economy. And today you're seeing that being sort of pulled back.
This really began in earnest under President Reagan. So the whole idea is to undo every last vestige of the New Deal.
One notable example of this was the 1999 repeal of two provisions of Glass-Steagall, which prevented the combination of commercial and investment banks. The federal government also forced states to relax their regulations on predatory lending, which is when a lender gives loans with full knowledge that they are unfair and will exploit the borrower. There was also a lack of regulation around securitization of mortgages, which allowed people to combine multiple subprime mortgages into a security and sell them as less risky than they actually were. These securities were very easily pushed upon people by predatory lenders who knew how risky they were. The resulting explosion of people with mortgages created a spike in housing prices and a bubble in the housing market. This bubble popped when many people defaulted on their subprime mortgages, meaning they were unable to pay back the banks. This caused a chain of bank failures starting with Lehman Brothers in 2008. The fact that the Glass-Steagall repeal made the banks bigger and made their vast investments rely on deposits, in other words, too big to fail, contributed to the scope of the resulting crisis. The so-called Great Recession caused then-Senator and presidential candidate Barack Obama to say this.
I think everybody knows now we are in the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression.
This situation would have almost certainly been avoided if the entirety of Glass-Steagall was still in place to limit the bank combinations, leading to their imperative level of economic responsibility. The bank failures would not have had such a widespread impact on the economy if they were not funded by the deposits of regular working people, which would have been outlawed by the repealed Glass-Steagall provisions. The resulting Great Recession was similar to the Great Depression in that many people were afflicted with financial struggles, but was different in the actions taken after. The one comparable regulatory measure to those of the New Deal passed in the wake of the Great Recession was the 2010 Dodd-Frank Act, expanding oversight of banks and creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which limited predatory lending. However, this act was not nearly as significant as the financial regulations of the New Deal. Dodd-Frank did not bring back the repealed provisions of Glass-Steagall, did not go as far in terms of regulations, and has already begun to be rolled back, leaving open the possibility of another devastating economic disaster in the not-too-distant future. The Great Depression was one of the most tragic eras in our nation's history, but the actions that the subsequent recovery necessitated still triumphantly affect the lives of Americans to this day. With laws such as the Emergency Banking Act and Glass-Steagall, the New Deal program stabilized the economy in their time and continue to do so in part almost a century later. However, this progress has not fully survived decades of attack by politicians, and the remains of New Deal regulations are a hollow shell in comparison to what they once were. In a time with levels of deregulation comparable to before the Great Depression, should we continue down this path towards a pre-Depression financial system, or is it time for America to return to the triumph of the New Deal to create financial stability for Americans once again?